Welcome to the Get Ready podcast. In our last episode, the guys discussed how experts have analyzed past civil conflicts around the world and have identified patterns and triggers that could help us predict the next civil war. Join us as RB shares his most likely civil war scenario here in America. Afterwards, the guys will share practical steps you can take to get ready for the conflict.
All right, RB, your turn. What does your scenario look like?
My scenario. A lot of people think now that Trump has been convicted that if he goes to jail and loses the election, there will be a civil war. And that, many people think, is the most likely cause for an upcoming civil war. This absolutely could happen, but I think the scenario that is most likely is actually Trump winning the election and a civil war happening in his second term.
Oh, yeah? How will that play out?
I think that there are a lot of similarities between what's going on today and the first U.S. Civil War. I think if we look at some of those historical similarities, it can predict when the next one is going to happen. So first, if you were to ask someone on the street, what led to the first Civil War? And just for fun, JD, what's your simplest explanation of what you think led to the Civil War?
Did you just ask me what led to the Civil War?
Yeah.
All right. It was slavery.
I think slavery is probably going to be the most common answer, especially if you're up north. I think if you're in the South, which I've moved to the South, and I have many people who don't think the Civil War is about slavery. They think it was about states' rights.
Right.
So I think you'll get one of those two answers, slavery or states' rights. Now, I want everyone to just think about what I'm going to say next. Very few people in the North at that time were abolitionists. They weren't trying to abolish slavery. There was a small vocal group, but very few people were actually trying to end slavery, not even Abraham Lincoln. And two, pre-1850, the South didn't want to secede from the Union. There was no talk of the South leaving the Union because the Union was actually controlled by the South. And I'll explain what I mean by that. So if the South didn't want to secede and the North didn't want to end slavery, how did we end up in a civil war about slavery and states' rights? We have to remember, before the Civil War started, there were only 34 states in the Union, and the Southern Democrats held 63% of the Senate seats and 55% of the House. So they dominated government. Now, there were, however, a lot of new states about to come online and join the Union. And those 16 states who eventually would join would determine the balance of power in Congress. And that's why the North wanted to make sure that those states did not allow slavery, because if they did, it would give Democrats an unbreakable grip on the power of government. And on the flip side, the Southern Democrats needed slavery to be legal in those new states to retain their political power. Why? Because slavery was the Democrats' wealth pump, right? We've talked a lot about wealth pumps. A massive labor force that cost next to nothing to employ. And that's exactly what happened in these plantations. You could grow cotton, you could grow tobacco, you could grow sugarcane. A free labor force would reap huge profits for the plantation owners. And then those plantation owners would fund the political campaigns of candidates that would pass laws to protect slavery. That's why there was a battle. That's why the South and the North fought, not over slavery or states' rights so much as the economic engine of the South. It wasn't so much morality-based. It was really about the control of Congress and making the laws that either supported the wealth pump of slavery or ended the wealth pump of slavery.
That's fascinating. So you're saying that they basically shrouded the economic agenda in a moral cloak, and it was really just to weaken the South economically.
And why did they need to weaken them economically? Because of the power to control Congress and make laws.
That's really interesting. So, slavery is immoral, but it's just interesting that it wasn't actual abolition of that. It was more the control over finances. That's a really interesting.
Yeah. And it still happens today. You think of the big social issues in America, whether it's immigration or, let's say, gay rights or trans issues, abortion. They're all framed as moral issues, but in a lot of ways, it's all about wealth and power.
Yeah, I love, I love seeing massive multi-billion-dollar corporate entities taking on social causes. I love it. Like you're talking about here is an entity whose only responsibility is built for profit. Now all of a sudden, changing their logo to reflect the pride flag or putting Black Lives Matter in all their social. And you're like, well, hang on a second. Could there be some financial incentive behind these causes? And the answer obviously is, of course. Otherwise, they wouldn't be taking them on.
Yep. It's all tied, especially politicians. Every issue seems to be a moral issue, and they could go to war over slavery because the immorality and the wickedness of slavery. But at the end of the day, it was really about who controls more seats in Congress. So I want to take that framework and apply it to where we're at today. We've got two wealth pumps that we've already discussed. The first is all of these low-skilled workers flooding into the country illegally and depressing the blue-collar wages. And of course, that's very different than legal immigration. But we're talking about illegal immigrants. That's the first wealth pump. The second wealth pump is the artificial intelligence. That's going to replace the majority of white-collar jobs. And again, depressing wages, because if you're in a white collar job and you can easily be replaced by AI, you're not going to be pushing for raises or demanding a higher salary. You're going to take whatever job at whatever pay you can get to stay employed. So who benefits from keeping these workers' wages low?
Some of the large corporates and their major stockholders.
Yeah, the wages you pay to workers, human resources are always the most expensive resources, partly because you're paying for the benefits, you're paying for a 401k match. All of that really adds up. And right now, all those business owners and the stockholders, many of them at the large level or like the mega corporation level are elites, either mega elites or that aspiring elite. And now I think the picture starts to come together. We've got these business owners who want loose immigration policy and no regulation of artificial intelligence because they can use that to drive more profits for their business. And I'll go ahead and say that there's nothing wrong with wanting to drive profit for the business. That's the point of being in business, is to create a profit for the owners and the stakeholders of the business. But what's happening here is all of those profits that are happening are being diverted to political campaigns of candidates who support the policies that keep these wealth pumps flowing, loose immigration and no regulation of AI. And right now, with those two wealth pumps in this day and age, it's the Democrats. It's the CEOs and owners of these mega corporations, the Facebooks, the Amazons, the Googles, who are donating massive amounts of money. We can all remember Zuckerberg and all of the political activities he spent millions of dollars on, the George Soroses of the world, who are trying to get DAs, very progressive DAs appointed, right? They're all investing in the political campaigns of people who support their agenda. And then on the opposite side of that, you've got Donald Trump, who vows to build a wall, who's going after big tech, wants to take away their protections. He wants to deport illegal immigrants, build that wall, break up big tech monopolies, and save people's jobs. And I think that save people's job is really interesting because he's said many times, whether it's the coal miners in West Virginia, whether it's the auto industry, who he rails against the electric vehicle push and the green initiatives. And again, remember that moral issue. Democrats are pushing the environmental piece as the moral issue, and then Republicans are pushing back and saying it's killing people's jobs. It could be steel. Steel workers was a big push a couple years back when Trump's like, hey, I'm not going to allow imports of cheap steel into the United States because that's going to destroy the manufacturing sector. All those low-skilled workers whose job is in danger of getting eliminated by either technology or immigration, those are the people that Trump is going after. And I think, as I said before, I do believe he's going to win the election, and that civil war is going to happen after the election, just like the first Civil War happened right after Lincoln was elected. And I think the Civil War is going to happen shortly after Trump's elected.
Interesting. Okay, so let's say Trump is reelected and he starts to, carry out these mass deportations and he rebuilds his wall. And then at the same time, he clamps down on AI. What events need to happen for us to reach an actual civil war?
I fully agree with what you said earlier, which is if people are employed and they're fed and they're generally happy in life, it's going to be hard for them to go out and sustainably riot. So I think we have to reach a tipping point economically where enough people are so miserable that they've got nothing left to lose, and their only option is to riot. So basically, people have to be so broke or inflation is so high that they can't afford to feed their families. And I think we all can agree that's already started. We're seeing it in certain groups in certain areas of the country. And then it kind of hits all of a sudden because these companies who are already firing massive amounts of workers, that gets sped up thanks to AI making more jobs irrelevant. And the progress of AI, I think you'd agree with this, is just insane.
The acceleration is nothing like I've ever seen.
It's incredible. But here's a good just sort of side note is you watch AI generated video of Will Smith eating spaghetti. It was like one of the early ones, and it is freaky. All like the weird facial and finger expressions of him like just slurping up massive amounts of this spaghetti. It's kind of creepy. And that was just a few years ago. And then you look now and it's like, oh, wow, it's actually hard to tell whether it's really Will Smith eating spaghetti. You should just do a quick YouTube search on Will Smith eats spaghetti AI. It'll amaze you at the progress. I mean, pretty soon we're going to have entire feature-length movies completely generated with AI. There's just no need for actors at that point. So anyway, AI speeds up to the point where more and more jobs are getting replaced. And then you leave the Fed with a tough decision to make because they've got a dual mandate. Keep inflation low. They want it at 2%, and keep unemployment low. But it gets really tricky when you have massive amounts of unemployment happening very quickly. If you raise interest rates, unemployment goes up. If you lower interest rates, inflation goes up. The Fed really doesn't want to lower interest rates because businesses are not going to use the extra capital to hire more workers this time. This time they're going to take that extra capital, the very cheap loans they can get from the bank, and they're going to use it to invest in technology that transitions us over to AI faster, stimulates parts of the economy, namely the tech sector, but also increases unemployment. And with that higher unemployment comes greater government spending in the form of welfare, unemployment benefits, food programs, and of course the loss of tax revenue. So government spending being the main cause of inflation is going to increase. So if the Fed lower rates, inflation goes up and unemployment goes up. So not a great option. On the flip side, if you raise interest rates, it makes servicing the national debt much more expensive. It also makes servicing personal debt, like credit cards and car loans, much more expensive. All of those industries that are built on loans, like housing, vehicle manufacturing, banks, and non-bank lenders, all of those industries and all the supporting industries, like construction and resource manufacturing, all the raw materials that goes into all of the manufacturing for those businesses, they all seize up and they start to fire people because they can't afford to pay wages when the revenue drops. So it makes it harder for those businesses to access the capital they need for inventory and equipment and payroll. So they end up, those businesses, when interest rates go high, they end up trying to save up the cash as much as possible until interest rates lower.
Yeah, and you can see this playing out now. You know, the theory, or practically it goes, when inflation runs hot, what you have to do is break the economy. You have to raise interest rates so high that people stop spending money. People stop borrowing money. Businesses close down. People get laid off. And what that does is it causes prices to cool. Reagan did it in the 80s where inflation was out of control. He stepped in. And at one point, I think the interest rate was as high as like 19%. Mm-hmm. And they did it for a short period in order to bring everything under control. However, what you have now, and I just think there's so much money in the system and corruption is just so rife that there is no appetite to break the system because it will impact the party that's in power. And so they don't want to get to a place where they've broken the economy, even if it's short term to fix it. They want to, I guess, just have their cake and eat it. And I think it started with quantitative easing. There was no correction after the housing crisis in 2008. They just printed more money. And so the good times really got to continue going with, there was some pain, but it wasn't as much pain as what the system actually called for. And so because we just keep kicking the can, no one has the stomach to put this country through the correction that is required in order to bring about some health into the economy. And so I think what you're seeing now is just exactly as you've summed it up, is you've got these competing forces of why we're in this almost death spiral where the medicine that we need is too bitter for anyone to swallow. And so we're just going to continue with the sickness. And all the while, inflation is just, these official numbers for inflation as well are so doctored. It's not the true reflection of how much prices have increased even in the last year. Life is just becoming more and more unaffordable. Businesses are drying up. People are getting laid off. It gets worse, right? Without the correction, without the medicine. You can see why there's this talk about a CBDC or a central bank digital currency. It's because that gets these forever politicians out of the hole that they're in if the government is just responsible now for the entire money supply, right? And so now you can set up a central currency that's completely controlled by the government, something like China, right? And then the amount of control that it gives the government then over things like poverty and unemployment and even controlling what people eat, what they say, because they get punished when they say the wrong thing, where they go, what they do. There's that piece to it as well. But you can see that the groundwork is being laid by this unsustainable economic climate that we're facing right now.
I agree. The CBDC, of course, there's massive privacy and freedom issues. But if you were to look at it on paper from the Fed's perspective, it's actually a really elegant solution because cutting or raising interest rates is like doing surgery with a hatchet when you really need a scalpel, because you've got certain individuals in the country, right, the more wealthy individuals, who are not even touched by inflation. There's so much money and wealth that inflation actually helps those individuals because they own the assets that inflate in value. So they keep on spending and spending on the services sector and other tech sectors that inflation helps. Likewise, you've got the less wealthy people that inflation is absolutely crushing. So when the Fed raises or lowers interest rates, they're actually not cooling the economy as much as they'd like to, and yet you're crushing the people at the bottom end of the economy. And that's why CBDCs are nice, because you can target specific sectors, cool those sectors, and then if different sectors need to be hotter, they can increase the spending for those particular areas. The problem is that the programmatic piece of the CBDCs and the freedom piece and the privacy piece and many other aspects of the CBDCs. But the whole point is that's what the Feds need. That is the medicine the Feds need in order to balance the economy, because there's such a massive difference in wealth between the rich class and the poor class. Whatever path they take, they're going to have to deal with either massive inflation or massive unemployment, because the CBDCs are not going to be rolled out in time for them to use it. So they're going to be stuck with their very broad tool, which is the federal fund rate. And so once they make changes to the inflation rate, you're going to be affecting the working poor and the educated unemployed. They're going to be suffering in a massive way. They're not going to be able to afford food. They're not going to be able to afford transportation or health care or any of the daily necessities we need in order to survive. And if you can't afford those things, you can't afford to get married. You can't afford to date people. You can't afford a wedding. You can't afford to have kids. You can't afford to buy a house. All of those dreams and those goals, they're not going to happen. They can't happen when you're absolutely broke. When you can't have the things you desperately want, the things you think you are entitled to, you end up with huge amounts of depression and anxiety. And we can already see that happening in Gen Z. To a point, it's going to get much worse. It's going to dominate society. And to treat that, we're going to have more drug and alcohol usage. People try to self-medicate and cope with their depression and anxiety and anger. All of that leads to higher crime, more strain on the healthcare system, more taxpayer money needed to pay out to support those people. Suicides will skyrocket once it's hit that tipping point because people just don't have a way out. I think we're going to see that entire generation of angry, broke, desperate young people who blame immigration, they blame corporations and business owners, they blame government and politicians, and they're going to want to lash out at who they think is responsible for it, i.e. the elites. And they're going to look for someone who promises that they can rebalance things and that they can have that American dream back. And I think it's either Trump in his second term or some sort of successor to Trump who's still that populist candidate with the same policies and same values as Trump. So this is where I think the scenario starts to play out. I think Trump begins to address the massive unrest and riots that are forming in the cities primarily for all of these people that are unemployed or the working poor. And I think he calls in the National Guard to start deporting illegal immigrants in a massive way that's never happened before in this country. And of course, that's going to be pushed back from the left because they are going to be supported by the business owners that benefit from immigration. So the left's going to call him a Nazi, rounding people up, deporting them. He's going to call him a racist. We're going to start to see terror attacks coming from the left and from the right, from the left who are attacking organizations that are trying to deport people. Again, very similar to slavery if you look at it back in the first Civil War. You're also going to see it from the right, who again are those unemployed or those working poor people who are angry against the politicians. So those protests and the counter protests, yes, immigration is going to be the moral excuse, just like slavery was. But really, it's going to be fueled by these firebrands on the right and on the left who are desperate for economic change. And then you're going to see this new wave of protests happening on top of that, which are the college graduates who can't find a job thanks to AI. So right now in America, at this day and age, there's a lot of protests about Israel and Palestine. That may or may not be an issue in a couple years. But those same people that are going to feel disenfranchised by their job loss thanks to AI, it's that same group who are already good at organizing, good at protesting, no longer in college campuses. They're going to take up the protests and the riots once again. They're going to demand stronger regulation for the technology companies, much in the same way that they demanded an increase in the federal minimum wage. And I think this is eventually going to result in universal basic income, which is another topic with its own problems. But ultimately, I think the cities are going to be hit the hardest. The protests are going to turn into riots with all the counter protests. The governors are going to start to have to call in the state guard in order to keep peace. There's going to be tons of arrests. The state guard ultimately, I don't think will be able to control the riots. There's just too many people. Those groups, they're going to overwhelm any sort of state guard that the governor has called up. And so the only option, because the cities are going to be on fire, the federal buildings are going to be on fire, the state buildings are going to be on fire, is to declare martial law to try to retain peace. And once martial law is declared in one state, other states are going to follow. And we'll officially be in the Civil War. And I think we could see kind of a preview of that in COVID with the lockdowns. Once these governors get some of that emergency powers in there, other governors follow as they're emboldened.
Yeah, totally. And these governors and politicians get high off their emergency powers. You saw what happened during COVID. So that might be the playbook, right? But extended. Shut down travel between states. Start controlling the food supply. Start employing curfews, confiscating people's firearms. And then maybe you'd start to see some interstate squabbles kicking off as well, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Especially if, let's just say Texas is, and I just made that up, but let's just say Texas carries out, a lot of deportations and someone nearby like Arizona that's, not politically aligned as Texas is, comes out against that. You could see some interstate, squabbles kicking off, and it's starting to get hot there too.
Yeah, I think we saw, again, a little preview back a few years ago in the COVID era where certain states, I think Georgia was a big one. I think they passed some election integrity laws, and the MLB didn't want their All-Star game to be held in Georgia, and Hollywood didn't want movies to be recorded in Georgia. There was a big old outcry from the blue states trying to boycott Georgia because of their election integrity stance. We already have sanctuary cities. I could see something like California being a sanctuary state where no federal deportation is allowed to take place. And that's where you're going to have a lot of these emergency orders called. And then you'll have their neighboring states, which will be a red state. And they're saying, well, we're not going to be able to allow people to come over from California into a red state because they may be illegal immigrants who are trying to migrate over into these other states. So we're just not going to allow anyone with a California license or no license at all to come over. So you start to see roadblocks on the borders of states. And basically the entire United States has become like the southern border where you have to have checkpoints everywhere.
And we've seen interstate tension being built over this immigration topic with Abbott busing illegals to different parts of the country, and those governors getting really upset by it. We saw a standoff with Texas and the federal government over setting up fences and patrolling certain areas. I think there's already, again, the groundwork has been laid. I think what we learned from COVID is that anything is possible when states start using their emergency powers.
I'm glad you brought that up because I completely forgot to mention a massive point. Up until this point in my scenario, we've talked about the impact economically to immigrants and why business owners want low wages so they can fund political campaigns. There's a second huge piece, which is the House of Representatives is not determined by the number of citizens in a particular location, but by the number of individuals who fill out a census in that location. So by busing immigrants to certain cities and locations, they can increase the number of seats in the House for those areas that are typically blue areas. That's why all the cities want immigrants. That's why New York and Chicago wants immigrants, is because they get more seats in the House for having a higher population, not necessarily citizens. By Trump deporting immigrants from certain areas, he's going to be doing the exact opposite. He's going to be taking seats away from blue areas. And of course, the Democrats don't want that to happen. So they're going to fight against the deportation and they're going to spin it to be a moral issue. How can you tear kids away from their parents and their families? And this is so Nazi and fascist of you to be treating people like this. And so that's going to be the same slavery moral issue, but it's really a political issue and a business wealth issue.
Yeah, I see that too.
Okay, so that's my scenario. I think we're probably a couple years out from that hot civil war that we just laid out. My earliest guess, if I were to put a timeline on it, is to say 2025, and I think latest 2027, 2028. And I think that all has to do with other kind of meta factors with immigration and AI technology, currently where we're at with the presidential piece, all of the money and the economic condition of the country today, and how long it's going to take to speed up to where the massive unemployment and inflation hits to start people being seriously angry. So just a summary for my scenario, immigration and AI are the two wealth pumps that I think are going to lead to civil war. Unemployment and the cost of living are the fuel that's going to fuel the tension. Trump is the populist movement that is going to lead all of these angry people. The riots and the violent protests, they're going to be sparks for the civil war. Those are going to be responded to by the governors declaring martial law once the state guard can't control the riots and the protests. And then once martial law begins, that I think is the official start point to the new civil war.
Yeah, I can see it playing out that way. But what if Trump doesn't win? What if, however it happens, Biden or whoever replaces him wins the election?
You know, I actually think that might speed things up a little bit, believe it or not. Because if Trump wins, all of his supporters, which is the group I've discussed primarily, if he wins, they are going to be happy that he won. And they're going to look to him to implement the policy changes, the deportations, the regulations that are going to help them out. So they're going to give him some time believing he's going to do that. If he loses, and especially if he rots in jail, he becomes a martyr. And all of his supporters who are already apt to protest on his behalf, those groups of people are going to be more sensitive and aware of the policies and the economic impact that immigration and AI are happening. Immigration and AI are going to impact the economic status of the country regardless of who gets in. It's just a matter of how quickly it impacts people and how likely they are to react and riot. And again, I think if he does not get in, especially if he's thrown in jail, that timeline speeds up because of the anger of the stolen election.
That's great. That's great. All right. So you ready to move into how we prep?
Yeah, let's do that. So let's take a quick moment. We'll do a product spotlight. We haven't done that in a while. We'll let Jeffries talk a little bit about a very cool product and how it could help you prepare for a civil war. And then JD, why don't you take us out with the practical preps for how to get prepared for the next civil war.
This week we are proud to announce a brand new product to the GetReady.life store, Premium Sliced Chicken Breast. Our cage-free chickens are raised by local farmers who believe that healthy, happy chickens just taste better. The select chickens are cooked, processed and freeze-dried by our fantastic partners, Freedom Foods, before they are sealed in either our 5-pound rehydrated protein packs or 20-pound rehydrated protein pails. Our freeze-dried foods lasts for 25 years and does not need to be refrigerated. It's a great option to fill that protein gap we'll all be facing if our country slides into another civil war. Check out our expanding line of freeze-dried foods at getready.life.
Okay, so quite honestly, RB and I spitballing as to what could cause a civil war, I think is interesting. I'm sure that, and we based it on some really big assumptions, none of which could be true. I think we should be less caught up in the how or the why and just more focused on the is, right? And so regardless of how it gets there, everyone that you talk to would acknowledge that something's cooking. There's deep dissatisfaction. There are massive, massive social rifts in which neighbors are assigning motive to their beliefs. So for instance, if you are anti-abortion, you hate women. If you are pro-abortion, you want to murder babies. If you are pro-Second Amendment, it's because you like kids getting shot in school. And if you're anti-Second Amendment, it's because you want complete government control and you want all conservative or people on the right thrown in jail. And so we've assigned these motives to each other. And so regardless of how it kicks off, everybody can agree that something's cooking. So then how do we get ready for it, right? And so if we think about it, there are 3 phases in how a civil war kicks off. So you have phase 1, which is the pre-Civil War turmoil. Phase 2, which is the actual civil war. And then 3 would be rebuilding. And I'm not sure we're going to get onto rebuilding in this episode. Let's just cover 1 and 2. So pre-Civil War and then the actual Civil War. I would say to build some kind of resiliency and to make it through the turmoil that hits pre-Civil War is to avoid being caught up in the wealth pumps. So if you're working or are about to enter the workforce, you really need to take a hard, honest look at whether or not your job can be replaced by cheap labor, illegal migrants, automation, or AI in the next 5 years. If so, you've got to actively manage that risk and either try switch to an industry that's less impacted or try figure out how to innovate in this area and be the one who controls the AI, for instance, right? There's courses, and this is what I say to people that I work with all the time, is that everyone's job, everyone in the skill-based economy's job, if it hasn't changed already, it's changing as we speak. You've got generative AI that's come in that can do things at a speed and with a quality that humans just cannot do. However, we're still a ways away from complete autonomous AI. And so it's important that we learn, one, we get a deep understanding of how AI works, and what it is, and then how to use it. And so there are lots of courses that are offered online that you can sign up for. You can do your own research, but you should really get your arms around how to stay relevant in your field with the wealth pump influencers that are spreading their tentacles right now and going to be taking on a much larger role.
Can I jump in with a thought there, which is if you want to survive, kind of to what you're saying in a skill-based economy, yes, you need to be able to use AI to increase your efficiency. But let's say in 10 years, AI 100% replaces your job. Like there's just no need for anyone to do what you do. And let's say in 5 years, 50% of your job has been replaced by AI. So they still may need you in order to manage the AI and put in prompts and QA stuff. That means that half your job is now spent managing the AI, and the other half is maybe doing things AI can't quite do yet. Well, if half your job is replaced by AI and you've become 50% more efficient, then the company needs half as many of you to do the same job, which means if you had 4 people on your team, now maybe there's only 2 people on your team, right? So even if you have the skills needed to do AI, and if everyone on your team has the AI skills needed, they still need half of you. So it's very likely that you may get caught up in a reduction in force, even if you have the AI hybrid skills, so to speak, or the supportive AI skills, just because the industry as a large is more efficient. So ultimately, they need less people. And of course, the ones that don't have any AI skills, they're going to be the first ones to go, right? So the more skills you have, the better your shot is of staying employed longer.
And there is a ton of resistance to AI making its way into the workforce. And you can take advantage of that resistance by embracing it and learning it and figuring out how to get ahead of it. We're at a watershed moment, and it's not going to help to try to burn down the machines. You got to go with it. I see it all the time. People refuse to make use of it because they can see how it's going to replace their day job. But by ignoring it or not grabbing hold of it, you're going to get left behind. So take control. You're a prepper. Prep for this and learn how to ride this train before it leaves the station.
The same thing happened with AI that happened in the late 80s and the 90s with the personal computer. And then again in the early 2000s with the internet. And there's going to be certain jobs that are going to be completely replaced, just like PC and the internet replaced certain jobs and industries completely. So let's talk a little bit about a couple of those jobs that we think are going to be hugely impacted by AI quickly. Let me run through a couple and you could chime in and tell me if you think of any ones that I missed. First, I think any type of data entry job is going to be difficult to keep. Telemarketing for two reasons. One, the regulation continues to get squeezed and tighter and more difficult and the penalties larger. But the chatting functionality through websites and even through the phone is so much better to where they really don't need humans to have conversations with other humans. The bots are so intelligent these days that it's sometimes hard to know if you're actually talking to a human or you're talking to a bot. Photography, especially stock photos. Stock photos are gone. I think there's still a little bit of room for high-end custom photos like weddings, but then you also have technology where the camera is so good where you can just allow your guests to record on their phones. And instead of having one photographer taking really good photos, now you have 100 guests submitting photos from all sorts of different angles. So I think even that custom stuff is going to be replaced. Let's say you have a family photo, you hire a photographer to take pictures of your family out in a field of flowers. You don't need to do that anymore. You could have one photo of each member of your family, just a face shot, and you could use AI to place all of your family in the field wearing all sorts of different outfits, all smiling, all perfect, and you wouldn't know the difference. So I think photography is probably gone as a profession. And then with that, artists, graphic designers, and website designers are all three, I think, going to be gone. And it's kind of sad because the artists, the graphic designers, created amazing content that taught all of the models on how to replicate their art, and they didn't get compensated. So just massive, massive theft. And unfortunately, all of those artists who created the content are now going to become unemployed. And there might be a couple here or there that are truly unique and different, but if you do anything remotely similar to what's currently out there, you will absolutely be replaced by AI. And then programming and coding. This is the really scary piece. If you're a programmer, most likely your job is going to be replaced. And that's what we talked about earlier, where you can get massive efficiencies as a programmer to have AI do a lot of the coding for you, and you just tell the AI what you want, and it'll code it out error-free. It'll debug code faster than you can. But the really scary thing is hacking, because AIs can write code. They can also break into systems, and they can scan systems for vulnerabilities and then write malicious code to inject themselves into those systems. So the only way to defend against AI-driven hackers is, of course, AI-built defensive systems. So you need to train AI on how to identify weaknesses in code before they're exploited and patch those weaknesses. So it's really just AI versus AI, both on coding and hacking and spying and many other high-level areas that we never thought would be replaced by AI. JD, why don't you go ahead and share a few of your thoughts? What industry do you think will be most affected?
Yeah, I mean, everything you've spoken about makes a ton of sense. It's interesting, and this does require a longer podcast because, you know, the target of a lot of these roles is, you know, in getting consumers to buy products. If everyone's out of work, then who's they're gonna be to buy the products, which brings in, you know, the universal basic income. And it's a really scary but good discussion to have. And what does that mean for living in a world like that? for all of us. But yeah, I mean, look, there's AI innovation in all of these fields, in medicine and it's across the board, and the acceleration has been fantastic, or not, depending on your view,
or frightening.
Frightening, right? But we're still a ways away from having an AI platform that can produce consistent, amazing quality of output over and over and over again. So not that it's not going to happen. You think about where we were 12 months ago with ChatGPT and where we are now, and we're absolutely going to get there. But I think that in all of these industries, at least for the short-term future, there are people that are going to be required to oversee these systems, right? Data entry being one, like, telemarketing, you listed all these things, photography. Someone needs to be able to manage, tweak, adjust, edit, QA. And so be that person, right? Like that's got to be your strategy, is how is AI impacting my industry and what are the roles of humans in managing these machines?
So what you said I think is important though, which is you've got two levels of skill set. You've got, we'll call it the worker bees, and then you've got the managers. And what you're saying is that we're still going to need managers. They're just going to be managing AI and AI results, or maybe some people using AI. But it's really that lower skill level that is currently doing a lot of the groundwork, the busy work.
Right.
Those are the people that are mostly going to get impacted, I think, and quickly.
Right. Yep. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the people in trades like plumbing, electrical, and construction. Because if you had thought about this 5 years ago, you would have said, "Well, those are a safe bet." How are you gonna get Gen AI to come in? And until Gen AI fuses with robotics, which again just looks like it's a way out, and I may be wrong. I probably am. But until such time as we get there, those would seem safe. However, this is where the illegal immigrant wealth pump is coming in. So while you might still have a job as an electrician, as a plumber, or doing anything in construction, you're feeling it today, is that your wages are impacted by this tidal wave of cheap labor. What you need to be thinking about is, A, how do you rise, and what are the assets, equity, skills that you have that cannot be replaced with cheap labor? So maybe, if you don't know how to manage a job, you should learn, right? Do a project management course, or learn how to lead and try rise above. And then outside of that, some of your strategies need to include making your lifestyle less dependent on your income. And this is for all of us, really. I mean, this really is for all of us. This is not just for anyone impacted by these wealth pumps. Like, growing more of your food with a goal of maybe being 100% self-sustaining, managing your health through diet and exercise so you're less reliant on big pharma and big medicine, right? Paying off debt, making sure you don't fall into these traps, these debt traps where, with interest rates being so high, you're just handing over money to the banks. And then other things, and this is what we talk about on this podcast, and how a lot of the people on our Telegram channel are living, is generating your own electricity for your home and your vehicle, homeschooling your kids, setting up networks with your neighbors and friends of the community so for you to barter and trade. I've heard some amazing stories lately of a guy trading ammunition for different things that he needed, which actually, as I say that out loud, might be illegal. Don't do anything illegal. But I just thought it was a funny story because he had stockpiled, and because of just how expensive everything it got, was using that to buy some just goods and services. And so obviously you're going to need income, but picking up odd jobs and cutting down on costs, I think that is going to be something that a lot of us, if not all of us, are going to have to do as the economy starts to fall apart around us due to these wealth dumps.
Yeah. Everything you've listed, 100% spot on. It's really talking about being resilient. And in our Telegram channel, recently I posted about being anti-fragile, which is different than resilience. And I know you've got a lot of thoughts. Maybe we'll do a topic on anti-fragility. But the core piece here is that when you've got a stressor in the system, resilience means you can take more of that stress without breaking. And anti-fragile means you actually become stronger when things are stressed out. And you can think of it like just a muscle, for example, right? You might have little micro tears as you work out, and then it builds back and your muscle is actually stronger than before. So what we've talked about here with growing your own food and reducing your dependency on your income, those are all resilient measures. But anti-fragility would be to benefit from illegal immigration and benefit from AI, which again, we've talked a little bit about before. But let's say, for example, you have a farm and you've got all of these migrants who will work for next to nothing. And then you've got some precious metals that have gone up in inflation. So you've made some investments to where you can sell some precious metals, get a lot of money for that, and then use that to hire very cheap labor to produce things that you can then sell for a profit, right? So that would be a little bit more of an anti-fragile approach. Basically, think in both ways, resilience and anti-fragility. That's where your head should be at, and that's where your lifestyle should be moving at pre-Civil War as things become more chaotic and turmoil increases. What about after Civil War? And in my scenario, it's martial law being declared. In your scenario, it's society has devolved to the point where government can no longer hold order, and all of these warlords are fighting for control of small pieces of land. How do you prepare for the actual conflict itself?
We're going to pick up the conversation with a detailed breakdown of how to deal with warlords and tyrants that will fill the vacuum of government in a war-torn America in the next episode. If you're enjoying War Games, our analysis on what America would look like if hit by various SHTF events, make sure you're subscribed to the Get Ready podcast on your favorite streaming platform. It's the best way to make sure you get notified when the next show drops. Thanks for sticking with us. We'll see you over on Part 3, the final chapter of our Civil War scenario, available to listen to right now.